He who fears he will suffer already suffers because he fears. Welcome to the second episode of this series on anxiety. During the first episode, we explored what exactly anxiety is, the distinction between states of anxiety, fear, and stress, when this innate capacity we all have in experiencing anxiety becomes abnormal, states and traits, how cognition and behaviours relate to either reinforcing or remedying anxiety, the role of agency in anxiety, as well as the Stoics' emphasis on focusing on what is within our control, echoing Seneca's affirmation, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." We're now going to pull from the wisdom provided by existential philosophy, rationalist philosophy, Eastern philosophies, and some of the schools of psychology which they have gone on to inspire, which look to offer us some concrete tools. We'll explore existential philosophy's profound discourse on freedom and the burden of choice, a theme continuously echoed by thinkers like Kierkegaard and Sartre, and its psychological counterpart, logotherapy, developed by Viktor Frankl, whose emphasis on the pursuit of meaning introduces therapeutic tools like dereflection and paradoxical intention as means to navigate and mitigate anxiety. Simultaneously, we'll delve into rationalism as well as the Eastern philosophies, which emphasize the illusion of self and the perpetuation of anxious states through attachment and desire. The aim is that by the end of the episode, we'll have introduced the main components of the philosophy and psychology of anxiety, laying the groundwork for subsequent discussions on physiology of anxiety and tools to leverage this knowledge in our favour, alongside the clinical strategies for managing anxiety disorders. We'll first turn to existentialism, and it's hard not to first start with the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, whose book The Concept of Anxiety is still relevant today. For Kierkegaard, anxiety, or angst, is intrinsically linked to the concept of freedom and the human capacity for choice. He describes anxiety as the dizziness of freedom that arises when an individual stands at the precipice of possibility and choice, confronted with the infinite potential of their own freedom. He highlights that the navigation of this freedom without predetermined guidelines, well, it's both exhilarating and terrifying. For Kierkegaard, anxiety is central to the formation of the self. In his view, the self is a relation that relates itself to its own possibilities. Thus, the experience of anxiety is a critical moment in which the individual becomes aware of their potential for selfhood and the responsibility that comes with it. This existential anxiety is therefore a precursor to self-realization and authentic existence, as it prompts the individual to confront their own identity and make choices that define who they are. Then we turn to Nietzsche, who, like most of his other contributions, had a unique perspective on anxiety. Though his perspective on anxiety is not offered through direct exposition, but instead an implicit undercurrent in his exploration of the human condition. Nietzsche is still commonly referred to today, and his name frequently gets quoted in debates. I would say this is because it's fair to say that Nietzsche was a world-class critic of pretty much all things society and culture, but he was extremely smart, with his writing being incredibly dense and hard to fully understand. So he did a pretty good job at diagnosing some of the problems. One of Nietzsche's most significant contributions was his declaration of the, quote, death of God, a metaphor for the collapse of traditional Christian values and the resultant rise of nihilism, the sense that life lacks objective meaning, purpose, or intrinsic value. This radical proclamation introduces a form of existential anxiety tied to the realization of the groundlessness of existence and the absence of a divine order. The anxiety arises not only because of the loss of certainty and the fear of meaninglessness, but also from the daunting freedom and responsibility to create one's own values and purpose. But he ties this into his concept of Superman, which represents Nietzsche's vision of an individual who transcends the conventional values and moralities of society, of which he would refer to as the herd, to create their own meaning and values. But he noted this transformation to be challenging and saw the existential anxiety as a necessary prerequisite to pursuing it. His unique contribution lied in framing anxiety not merely as an individual psychological phenomena, but as a cultural and existential crisis precipitated by the loss of absolute values and the daunting task of the individual's self-creation in what he saw to be a godless world. In this way, to Nietzsche, anxiety can be seen as both a symptom and a response to the challenges of living in a world without predetermined meanings or values held in traditional societies. This would be a good time to segue now briefly to the psychology inspired by existential thought, and the best example of this, without a doubt, is logotherapy. I've spoken previously on logotherapy from a theoretical perspective, so I'll focus today instead on skimming over some of the practical applications and techniques used in the context of anxiety. These techniques are based on the observation that much of our emotional disturbances are a result of a distinct lack of purpose or meaning. As a consequence of this, we see the formation of what its founder, Viktor Frankl, described as the existential vacuum, a void, an empty space within us which, if not filled with an outward meaning, invites a range of emotional disturbances which thrive on this inward state of self-preoccupation and rumination. Frankl examined the nature of these disturbances, going on to address the nature of anxiety, in which he explained the phenomena of anticipatory anxiety. Anticipatory anxiety is simply the observation that anxiety is perpetuated by resisting it. The understanding that what we resist persists. For example, if someone is afraid of blushing as they go into a crowded room, they're more likely to do so. Individuals often don't just become anxious about something, they often also get anxious about becoming anxious, setting up a vicious feedback loop. The technique of paradoxical intention is used mainly to counteract this anticipatory anxiety. Paradoxical intention is where an individual is encouraged to intend to have happen exactly what they are anxious about. Needed here is our innate ability to self-detach, ingrained in a sense of humour. Logotherapy aims to utilise this ability to combat our various emotional disturbances. The therapeutic effects of this approach stem from the basic premise that desire and humour opposes fear. You'll probably notice yourself that when you're exaggerating or laughing at the expense of something, the fear associated with it evaporates. This is because the reinforcement of fear is only ever made possible by our nature to flee from it, fight it, or freeze in front of it. For Frankl, in order to use this effectively, one needs to decipher the three dimensions that constitute the human person: the body, the mind, and the noetic. The body is our biological vessel consisting of physical matter, which is home to complex physiological functions and chemical processes. The mind places itself in the psychological dimension, loosely composed of our cognitions and emotions. The third dimension, the noetic, consists of the states that are able to observe both our physiological and psychological state. As Frankl stated, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our ability to self-detach, it's in this space that paradoxical intention works. We create a space between our symptoms, which we have, and our identity, which we are, by humouring the absurdity of them. Other phenomena also explored in logotherapy is hyperintention and hyperreflection. Hyperintention is the observation that forced intention makes one's forced wishes impossible. As Frankl explains, this is especially evident in the case of sexual neurosis. The more a male tries to demonstrate his sexual potency, the less able they are to succeed. The conclusion Frankl makes from this is that pleasure is and must remain a side effect or byproduct, and is destroyed and spoiled to the degree to which it's made a goal in itself. The same way excessive intention can lead to negative results. Also addressed in logotherapy is the idea of excessive attention, aka hyperreflection. An example given in the book Man's Search for Meaning is that of a woman experiencing sexual difficulties. It's explained that she was subject to sexual abuse as a child. It was not this that in fact led to her experiencing sexual difficulties, but it was in fact, after reading popular psychoanalytic literature, this woman had lived constantly with the fear of the effect this traumatic experience would have on future consensual encounters. This anticipatory anxiety resulted in excessive attention towards herself during these encounters, as well as excessive intention to confirm her femininity. As Frankl states in his book, this was enough to incapacitate the patient from the peak experience of sexual pleasure, since the peak experience was made an object of intention and an object of attention as well, instead of remaining an unintended effect of unreflected dedication and surrender to the partner. When her attention was refocused towards the proper object, i.e. the partner, peak experience established itself spontaneously. This brings us to the last technique I'll touch on, dereflection. This involves the deliberate refocusing of one's attention away from themselves and towards other people or goals that they identify to be meaningful. This isn't a distraction technique. It's a technique that takes your attention away from your self-distraction and towards meaningful potentials. It replaces self-concern with self-commitment. So the two techniques described, paradoxical intention and dereflection, ultimately work in differing ways to address the common issues which occur as a result of anxious states. Where paradoxical intention utilizes self-detachment, dereflection utilizes self-transcendence. Where paradoxical intention seeks to mock the symptoms in question, dereflection seeks to minimize them. Turning away from existentialism towards rationalism, Spinoza, without doubt, alongside many other contributions, offered some profound insights into anxiety. For Spinoza, the key to overcoming anxiety lies in the acquisition of adequate knowledge, particularly the understanding of oneself and the world through the lens of reason. Spinoza distinguishes three kinds of knowledge: imagination or opinion, rational knowledge, and intuitive knowledge. Much of human anxiety, Spinoza argues, stems from the first kind, imagination or opinion, where our understanding of events is clouded by incomplete, inaccurate perceptions and emotional responses. He felt that by advancing to the second and third kinds of knowledge, individuals can achieve more profound, accurate understandings of their place in the natural order, reducing the sway of fluctuating emotions and thereby mitigating feelings of anxiety. And it's this rational understanding which allows individuals to see themselves and their concerns as part of the broader interconnected web of existence, diminishing the existential weight of personal anxieties. For Spinoza and rationalism in general, it's through reason and the development of adequate ideas that individuals can achieve a level of detachment from their emotions, not by denying them, but by understanding their causes and nature. The intellectual mastery over the fluctuation of emotions enables the transition from passive emotional states, where one is at mercy of external forces, to active states, where one understands and thus controls their reactions in line with what is true and right. Despite all of this, at the core of Spinoza's philosophy is the idea that true knowledge and understanding comes from an introspective journey into the nature of being. This introspective journey isn't detached from the external world, but rather involves a deep rational analysis of one's place within it. For Spinoza, the emphasis is on the internal process of reasoning and reflection to arrive on an understanding of the universal laws that govern our reality, rather than empirical observation or accumulation of facts alone. Transitioning from the rationalist insights of Spinoza, we find a compelling resonance with the philosophies of Buddhism, particularly on the emphasis on understanding the nature of our experience of reality and our place within it. In the context of anxiety, it's Buddhism's deep inquiry into the nature of suffering that is rich in insight. It makes a compelling case which conceptualizes that the root causes of suffering lie in desire, aversion, and ignorance. At its core, suffering stems from ignorance, the misunderstanding of life's transient and interdependent nature. It's this ignorance which breeds attachment in the form of desire and aversion, where desire is our clinging to possessions or outcomes, and aversion is our resistance to discomfort and unwanted experiences. Anxiety from this viewpoint is a profound manifestation of these elements, the deep struggle with uncertainty, and a craving for security in the face of life's inherent unpredictability. Another insight essential to take into account when appreciating the unique contributions Eastern philosophies have in the context of anxiety is in its exploration of the self. Now, I've spoken on a previous episode on mindfulness meditation about its path towards the inevitable discovery that is made, that is the self, the thing appearing to do the observing, or this too is an illusion. Given I've previously gone into depth on this, I won't go further into it now. But suffice to say, this basic concept and the direct experience of the illusion of self, well, it challenges the very foundation of anxiety for the simple reason that, well, anxiety often stems from a solidified sense of self or ego. By appreciating that there is no unchanging permanent self to defend or aggrandize, the self-centric sources of anxiety related to self-image, personal achievement, or loss become much less gripping. Now, mindfulness, a core component of the liberation of suffering in Buddhist teachings, has been adapted into modern psychotherapeutic approaches to address anxiety, most notably in the form of mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. But I think its real strength lies in the fact that its benefits are available to anyone. You don't need a smartphone, paid apps, or a therapist, nor do you need profound intellectual capacity, as its insights are gained through direct experience, as opposed to conceptual understanding or academic achievement. And so the only thing that you really need to reap its benefits is time. With the dedicated practice of mindfulness meditation, access to a state of awareness where thoughts are seen as transient mental events, rather than definitive reflections of reality, well, over time this state starts to require far less concentration to achieve. This shift in perspective creates the much needed gap between yourself and the anxiety you had once mistakenly taken at face value. So that wraps up our philosophical and psychological exploration of anxiety. In the next episode, I'll be looking into the science, leveraging our understanding of the physiology that lies underneath anxiety to our advantage. I hope you enjoyed, and again, thanks for listening.